being the dean of this great law school, Detroit Mercy Law. I'm so glad that you're here tonight to engage in this important conversation about guns, gun safety, gun violence, and statutes in Michigan that have to do with all of that. This event is organized by a student organization, the Organization for Student Safety. Scott Freda is the president, and I'm going to turn things over to him to introduce our speakers and explain how we will proceed. Scott.
All right, welcome everybody. I'm Scott Freda, the founder and president of the Organization for Student Safety, and I would like to thank all of you for being here today, and I would like to say welcome to everyone who's going to be watching this at a later point. Before we get started, I'd like to just give a special thanks to a few people who are absolutely integral for tonight happening. First, Dean of Students Megan Jennings, who has probably fielded more emails from me than she ever thought she would, and probably enough to last the rest of this year. Dean of Student Services, Jeffrey Johnson, who at times seems like he keeps the entire building afloat single-handedly. I'd like to thank the OSS Vice President, Rosanna Abufara, who most of you met coming in here, and she is the one who made sure that we had food tonight. So on your way out, give her a special thanks. And I would, of course, like to thank both of our panelists here. This is Rick Ector of Legally Armed in Detroit. Mr. Ector is the founder and head and an advocate of private ownership and public carry firearms. He is an accredited NRA instructor and gives CPL and firearm safety classes to people in the southeast of Michigan. And over here we have Dr. Linda Brundage, who has an EED and is a licensed psychologist. Dr. Brundage is the founder and executive director of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. She has she is a gun control advocate who has testified before the Michigan legislature on the topic. So very briefly on the format, each of the panelists has been given a maximum of 15 minutes to make an introduction, and then we will just be moving through the questions for the remainder of the evening. So thank you very much. And Dr. Brundage, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you. The Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence is appalled by the police shootings of unarmed civilians, especially how these shootings have afflicted communities of color. We support legislation and policing practices that ensure the police are equitably serving all of the public, including Black and Latino Americans. We believe that police violence is fueled by systemic racism and that the American gun industry profits by militarizing the police against American citizens, exploiting racism to militarize the American public. If we want to put an end to this senseless tragedy, we must stand up to ignorance and hate, and we must also stand up to the gun industry and the NRA. That means standing up to our gun-pushing legislators, like the one who is trying to put more guns in schools, or the ones pushing permitless carry, or the ones who will not allow even a hearing on sensible gun laws. The gun industry is a parasite that feeds off of human misery. It cares nothing for Black lives or blue lives or any lives, only profit. But its day has come. We are paying attention and speaking out, and we're going to take our communities back from anyone who puts profit over life. Thank you very much to the Detroit Mercy Law School for the opportunity to speak this evening. As Scott mentioned, I'm Dr. Linda Brundage. I'm a mom, a grandma, and a psychologist, a person of faith. I'm currently the executive director of the Michigan Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Our mission statement is, and I quote, "We are a grassroots organization working toward the prevention of gun violence through community education and stronger gun laws." I want to contextualize for you the work we're trying to do here. Too often, this discussion is filled only with numbers and statistics. You know, 30,000 plus deaths from guns every year, 22,000 of these being suicides, 8 children every day, 91 Americans every day. If all we know are the numbers, it's too easy to turn away. And really, aren't statistics numbers with the tears washed off? I want us to have to consider what we're really talking about. My friend Sandy lost her daughter at the Aurora theater shooting. And she wrote these words 3 years after the death of Jessie, when she was finally able to view the autopsy. And I quote, "I knew, of course, about the 6 gunshot wounds that killed her, about the armor-piercing bullet that slammed into her head, but I did not know the details, and it was time to know. At the autopsy, my husband and I didn't look at the photographs. We looked at a diagram of what had been done to my beautiful daughter's tiny body. Her right leg was ripped apart and rammed into her left leg. Her abdomen received 4 bullets and the additional fragments. Fragments were lodged in her right wrist and other places. Her left clavicle was broken by a bullet, and her head, a bullet left a 5-inch hole. The bullet entered through her left eye, ripping apart her brain," unquote. I read a bit of Sandy's story to try to humanize what we're talking about here. It communicates some of the pain of gun violence. I also want you to understand the breadth of the problem. Americans are much, much more likely to be killed by guns than people in other countries. When 9 people are gunned down at Oregon Community College, or 14 fatally shot at a holiday party in California, 9 parishioners killed at a church in Charleston, the world pays attention. These bursts of violence are terrific, horrific, and specific, but we also must consider the daily grinding deaths in our cities and our villages that make up the pervasive background noise of gun violence in America. The gun homicide rate in the United States is more than 25 times higher than other high-income countries. According to a new study in the American Journal of Medicine, this divide was particularly acute for young people. The gun homicide rate for Americans between the ages of 15 and 24 is an astronomical 49 times higher than it is for people that age in other comparable countries. The rate of unintentional deaths involving guns was also more than 6 times higher here. We believe that common sense solutions will help decrease the escalating epidemic of gun violence that kills an American child every 3 hours and 15 minutes. To the NRA, I say, you fear we'll take your guns. We fear you'll take our children. Whether the gun violence happens in urban Detroit, suburban Okemos, or in the UP, we must act now for new and stronger gun laws and policies to protect our children and communities. We live in a gun culture. Guns have become our first line of either offense or defense. Road rage in Howell, Renisha McBride in Dearborn. And despite the research that tells us that states with the highest number of gun owners also has the highest rate of homicides of policemen, we have the Detroit Chief of Police supporting citizens arming themselves. Open carry advocates are carrying guns in our schools. I'm angry about the state of guns in the United States, and I think we should all be angry. The gun laws in the United States are unjust and should make us angry and move us to act. Want to know about guns in the U.S.? Follow the money. The result for a publicly owned company like Smith & Wesson is that an increase in share price from $5 in 2009 to nearly 26 at the end of the third quarter. After mass shootings, sales go up because people start getting freaked out. This is a quote from a gun store owner. After these mass shootings, gun sales go up because people start getting freaked out. Elections tend to raise gun sales also because people think that the government is going to take our guns away. So they stock up. I hate seeing shootings happen, but it's definitely good for business. Right now, our best-selling rifle is a Smith & Wesson, an AR-15 rifle, very popular gun, unquote. Cold hard cash is paid by the gun manufacturing sector to the National Rifle Association to sell and promote guns everywhere. I have not found the NRA decrying the deaths of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Jordan Davis, or Tamir Rice. Did they question the qualifications of or the affiliations of the sharpshooters on the roofs of the buildings in Ferguson? What was the response of the NRA when 50 people were killed at Orlando? Whose pockets are lined with the attitude of guns everywhere? Does this response help education in the United States, our mental health system, our public health system? No, of course it doesn't, but it sure sells guns. Josh Horowitz, director of the Coalition to Stop Gun Violence in Washington, argues that more guns equal more crime. These are complicated issues, but the empirical evidence shows that the states with the lowest gun ownership and the tightest restrictions have the fewest incidences of gun violence, unquote. Despite what gun advocates claim, a recent international study of 27 developed countries found that the United States had the highest rate of gun ownership per capita and not surprisingly, the highest rate of gun-related deaths. Part of what drives crime is joblessness, homelessness, lack of education, and economic opportunity. If policymakers spent more time focusing on these issues instead of arming the citizenry, people wouldn't feel the need to own as many guns in the first place. Just a couple more horrifying notes. Guns killed more preschoolers in 1 year than they did law enforcement officers in the line of duty. Gun deaths in the United States since 1968 exceed the casualty totals of all U.S. wars. I put a pencil to it, that's accurate. These numbers are so staggering that it led a respected UK journalist to ponder whether or not the UN should get involved to help us with our crisis of gun violence. Gun violence is a public health issue. It's a public health crisis in America. 8 children every day shot and killed. Gun violence is the leading cause of death among African American children and teens. Michigan is third in the nation in the number of Black homicide victims. Anything else responsible for this many deaths would immediately be investigated and regulated. As a point of reference, the Violence Policy Center's recent publication points out that in 12 states and the District of Columbia, gun deaths outpace motor vehicle deaths. And Michigan is one of the states, and that is true here, since 2011, I believe. So motor vehicle deaths are on the decline because we've improved safety, we've taken a public health approach to drunk driving, for instance, and we could do the same with the gun violence if we would choose to do that. I'd like to turn our attention to deaths by firearms in children and young adults. American children are 16 times more likely to be killed in unintentional shootings than their peers in other high-income countries. In the past year, studies and media reports have documented America's extraordinary number of child-involved shootings. These occur when a child happens on a gun or is left alone with one and ends up shooting themselves or another person. Such disasters result in hundreds of child fatalities and have made American children much more likely to die in gun accidents than children elsewhere in the developed world. The stories are endless and gruesome. A toddler shoots an infant while they're left alone in a car. A 5-year-old boy shoots a 3-year-old girl, and on and on. Talk of good guys and bad guys in this context loses all meaning when a toddler has shot a baby brother. Too many guns. We could acknowledge we've got too many guns and get serious about reducing these numbers. Calls for better mental health treatment as a preventable measure almost always follows a mass shooting. You often hear the gun lobby say mass shootings happen only in gun-free zones. This is factually wrong. The truth is that 80% of mass shootings happen in the home, and the perpetrator is the male gun owner also living in that home. This year, 2016, there have been 292 mass shootings so far. They're so horrible that people respond with the assumption that the shooter is mentally ill. In some cases, that might prove to be true. However, mass shootings by a disturbed individual is statistically rare and virtually unpredictable. In general, the mentally ill are no more likely to commit acts of violence than the general population. Only 4% of all violence in the United States can be attributed to mental illness. This mental illness being raised in the context of gun violence, particularly mass shootings, can provide a false sense of security to the general public and can invoke avoidance and social rejection. I see Scott's signaling me that my time is up, so I'll save the last bit for later time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brundage. Mr. Ector, whenever you're ready.
Thank you. First and foremost, I want to thank everyone in attendance for being here, and to the college and to the student organization for inviting me to be here. Offhand, when I make a statement like that, people that know me, they know that I tend to stay out of places that we affectionately call PFZs, pistol-free zones. Pistol-free zones are places that are either statutorily defined as places where a firearm cannot legally be carried. So, as a general course of action, I tend to stay out of them. Just ask yourself, as you're sitting here in this room, we are all peaceable, law-abiding, we're not bothering anyone, we're having a great time having a debate, listening to the conversations and the discussions that are going to come out of that. What if an individual who, for whatever reason, decided to come into this pistol-free zone and barge himself into this room and pulled out a firearm, whether it's a handgun or whether it's a long gun, and just decided to start picking us off and start injuring and killing us? By coming to a place such as this today, I have pretty much acquiesced, I've pretty much given up the fact that I will be able to mount a credible defense against some person who, for whatever reason, decided to come into this room. A lot of times people, when they first hear that there is no right to not be a crime victim, they're a little taken back by that. We've had numerous decisions by the Supreme Court, most notably Castle Rock versus Gonzalez, in which the Supreme Court has come out and stated that you definitely do not have a right to not be a crime victim. Ultimately, the conclusion is this: if the government is not responsible for your safety, then who is? Either you take responsible for your safety or you outsource it to some other person. By outsourcing it to some other person, we're either talking about a law enforcement agency that has no duty to prevent you from being a crime victim, or if you are an elitist, a person who feels that your status, your place in life makes you a more valued member of society, and you have public dollars being allocated to the protection of that individual. Or maybe perhaps you're a person who has just abdicated any reasonable defense of your person, defense of your home. And in this environment today, as we're approaching this upcoming election, in my personal opinion, the Second Amendment is on the ballot. I had the opportunity to attend the National Rifle Association's annual meeting a few months ago, and I listened to one of the candidates. That candidate was the Republican nominee, Trump. He basically came out and told us that he would definitely support and defend the Second Amendment, and that choice would be reflected in his appointment to replace the recently deceased Antonin Scalia, who suddenly passed away not too long ago. Our other candidate, who's from the other party, Hillary Clinton, she has made it known. She's come out on the record and she stated she believes that the Supreme Court got it wrong on Heller and on McDonald. What exactly does Heller and McDonald mean? In the Heller case, the Supreme Court came out and said, no, there is a constitutional right for individual ownership of firearms, especially for self-defense. You cannot just unilaterally just ban guns. Okay. That decision only held for the residents in the District of Columbia. That happened in 2008. In 2010, the issue was raised again in the Supreme Court case, McDonald versus the City of Chicago. And in very similar fashion, the Supreme Court said, hey, look, you cannot ban guns. If we have a major political candidate who's telling us that the Supreme Court got it wrong, then yes, the Second Amendment is surely on the ballot. When you look at the Heller case, the McDonald case, we're not talking about the right to open carry a firearm. We're not even talking about the right to have a concealed carry license, whether it's issued on a discretionary basis or whether it's issued on a shall issue basis. We're talking about, do you have the right to at least have a gun in your home to protect yourself? That's what we're talking about. And when you hear the anti-gun advocates talk, they like to tell us this flowery prose that they're all for reasonable restrictions and reasonable so-called gun sense laws that make sense. Consider the Mariana Islands, which, believe it or not, is a possession of the United States. Just a few months ago, they were told by a court that they could not ban guns. Flat out, could not ban them. Reasonable regulation, despite the fact that the Second Amendment is very clear on what it means, especially when it says, shall not be infringed. Those anti-gun government folk in the Mariana Islands decided that their response to reasonable gun control, since they couldn't outright ban guns, was to impose a $1,000 tax on a firearm. A $1,000 tax. Obviously, it went back to court, and again, it was determined that their so-called reasonable gun control, gun legislation was anything but. There are over 20,000 gun laws on the books in the United States and more in sight. When you hear these anti-gun people talk, they have such ridiculous ideas as to what reasonable means. The first one that comes to mind is this no-fly, no-buy gun law that they're proposing. As a matter of fact, several members of the House of Representatives were staging a sit-in. Television, of course, I don't recall in the history books any sit-ins having catered food, but that's beside the point. Their idea is that if you are on a terrorist watch list, you should be banned from owning a gun. What they're really talking about is the death of due process. What we're talking about is this so-called terrorist list, where an individual is put on a list, is not notified that he's on the list, he's not notified how to get off of the list. There is no prescribed manner for someone to get off of the list. The simple fact that you are present here in this room today might signal to certain political types in our government that you harbor certain sentiments. With that described process for the terror list, you all could be indiscriminately put on that list and by extension be denied a fundamental, God-given, inalienable, constitutionally right to own a firearm. State of Michigan, Article 1, Section 6, no person shall be denied arms for the defense of himself and for the state. And of course we have the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution. A lot of times when I go to events such as this and we talk about gun control or gun rights or gun freedom, many times there isn't a whole lot of honest talk that's being delivered. We hear about nebulous statistics. We hear about the much bandied 90% of Americans who are in favor of background checks, universal background checks. Let me tell you this. If there was ever an issue that could get 90% support from anyone on anything, it's a no-brainer and a slam dunk. Let me give you a hint. As a matter of fact, with regards to those sources, whether it was the Quinnipiac University poll, CBS New York Times poll, the Gallup poll, they did not ask in those polls, do you support universal background checks? Some of the chicanery and the dishonesty from these anti-gun people, the question really asked just a little bit more than, do you want to stop criminals from getting guns? That poll question was hijacked and diverted and converted to, do you support background checks? And oh, by the way, in a 2003 Pew poll, when talked about the background checks that were being rejected by the U.S. Senate, of course the Democrats disapproving of it at 67%. Republicans were happy at 51 versus 34. Independents, they loved it, 48% to 41%. 2003, the Reason Root poll. Move on to other issues. Should we move on to other issues or should we beat this gun rights issue to death? 62% of people who responded said, you know what, it's time to move on. They didn't tell you about the 2016 CNN ORC poll. At 53% to 43%, they disapprove of President Obama's stance and direction on firearms. As a matter of fact, the stuff, the things, the statements they make, it just flies in the face of common sense and facts. Another fact I'd like to throw out to you. 40% of guns are bought without a background check. First and foremost, when we start talking about background checks, states such as Michigan, we already have background checks on handguns. What they really want to do is now have background checks on rifles and shotguns. All federally licensed firearms dealers are required to do those checks when those guns are purchased. This 40% number is bogus. It comes from the 1994 survey from Guns in America poll. Sample was a pitifully small 251 replies. The question was, have you ever bought a firearm or received a firearm within the last 2 years? This, of course, included gifts, inheritances, and other transfers. Then they take this woeful, pitiful study from 22 years ago, and then you see someone like Clinton on the campaign trail, and she starts taking this, and she's saying, well, gee, we need to close that gun show loophole. People are buying guns at gun shows without background checks, and that's patently false. Another lie they'll tell you is that you can buy guns over the internet without a background check. And yes, that too is a lie. The people that they're talking to haven't actually bought a gun at a gun show or bought a gun over the internet. And let me tell you, you do need to pass a background check either at a gun show or over the internet. There's a lack of honesty in the actual debate. Too many times when a troubled individual goes into a gun-free zone, which is nothing more than an advertised honeypot for someone who has a desire for whatever sick reason to rack up a huge body count. No measures, so-called common sense measures they can give you would have prevented any of it. The bottom line is that evil, true evil, does exist in this world. And those of us who recognize it and realize that the best way to fight evil is to smite it whenever it rears its ugly head, we're up for the challenge. If you are not willing to fight for your safety, or fight for your family, or fight for your home, fine, don't buy a gun. Just don't infringe upon my right to do so.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ector. So let's get started with the first question. Mr. Ector had won a coin toss, so he is going to be getting the first one. We're going to start with the broadest question of the evening, but it's the answer to which likely shapes many of your positions on the matter. Based on your knowledge and research of the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court cases that have attempted to clarify its bounds, how do you view the right of American citizens to possess firearms?
My personal opinion squares with the opinion that was levied, that was assessed and given in both the Heller decision and in the McDonald decision. I made reference to those in my opening remarks. The Second Amendment is an individual right. No one can flat out ban a constitutionally recognized right. And of course, there's some debate as to what reasonable regulations can exist. Certainly a $1,000 tax is obviously discriminatory towards poor people and people of color who are not in a position to afford a $1,000 per firearm tax.
Thank you. Dr. Brundage?
Well, I think Scalia actually said in his remarks, I'm not able to quote those exactly, but the right to own and bear arms is not absolute, that we can have reasonable limits on those rights. This is really not a Second Amendment issue. There's not a gun violence prevention organization in the United States, including ours, that is coming after guns. That is a red herring. That's not what the discussion is about. The discussion from our point is reducing gun violence, reducing gun violence. A part that I didn't get to tell you about earlier is more information about, of the 33,000 deaths in the United States to guns, 22,000 of those are suicides. 22,000 suicides secondary to gun violence in this country. And when suicide is addressed in the context of firearm violence, it should be an important part of effective policy to prevent firearm violence. Suicide is the third leading cause of death of people in that age category 15 to 24. The majority of people who commit suicide have some identified mental health problem.
Dr. Brundage, we will be getting to mental health later, but could you
Okay.
please tailor a bit more towards the question about your view on how far the Second Amendment extends?
I get the Second Amendment. Michigan is a hunting state. It is true that people have a right to own a gun and the right to protect their own home. But I think, that is not an absolute right. And any of the kinds of things that are proposed don't infringe on that right.
Thank you. And a follow-up to both of you. Mr. Ector, to look specifically at the phrase, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, why should that not be read as the extent to which, or the purpose of which, the framers intended the Second Amendment to apply?
Well, to truly understand what well-regulated means, to understand what the militia means, you have to interpret it within the context of that time. A well-regulated militia. Regulated means trained. Militia. A militia back during those days was not the precursor to the National Guard like a lot of anti-gun types will tell you. All members of the militia were all able-bodied men and women with guns who wanted to defend our country. We just recently survived a very big, crucial war, and it was imperative that everyone who was able-bodied and armed to come to the defense of this newly established nation.
Thank you. Dr. Brundage, going on the same phrase, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, why should that not be viewed broadly, as if just one of the many reasons that the framers felt it was vital for the population to have access to firearms?
Well, one thing I would encourage people to do is think about the muskets that people used back in those days. They put the firearm in, they tamped it down, they took a shot, then they stopped, put more firepower in, tamped it down, and another shot. I don't think that our framers of the Constitution had in mind an AR-15. I don't think they did.
Thank you. And that actually can bring us to a question specific to Mr. Ector. And the question is, should firearms that have potential for harm that greatly outweighs their defensive value be prohibited? Specifically just looking at certain types of weapons.
Well, I had to chuckle internally when I heard all of this talk about the firearms, the muskets that the framers and the founders used back in the day. I call it the musket argument when I hear it. And by extension, what this means is that, okay, when the Second Amendment was first established, everyone was using muskets. So you know what? The Second Amendment must only apply to muskets. If you follow that logic, illogic, or however you want to discuss it, then you talk about the need for us to actually get a Supreme Court decision to tell us that yes, free speech, the First Amendment, does actually apply on the internet. Do we really need the Supreme Court to tell us we have free speech everywhere? The thing that's most important is that there's a reason why we have the Second Amendment. There's a reason why it's second. The First Amendment was first. First, to address your grievances to your government and to the king without losing your head. The Second Amendment is not about hunting, which I heard a few times already. And to be quite honest, it comes in quite handy for self-defense and for defending your home. But the reason for the Second Amendment is to overthrow a tyrannical government. That's what that purpose is for. And should we have appropriate arms of the day commensurate with the government, we absolutely should have commensurate firearms. No one should be limited to muskets. And a frequent anti-gun argument I hear, it plays upon the ignorance of people. We should ban all semi-automatic firearms. They're playing upon the fact that the average person that they're talking to doesn't even realize what a semi-automatic firearm is. It's a firearm that discharges one time per trigger pull. Like I said, when these people talk, they use misdirection, they give you false information, and try to mislead you from the truth.
Thank you. Do you have a rebuttal, Dr. Brundage?
Yes, I certainly do. It's true that we have a First Amendment, that is the amendment, the one about free speech, and you can't yell fire in a theater. So all of our rights have some parameters, and we are suggesting that the Second Amendment could also have those kinds of parameters. If we had comprehensive background checks, and we could have, and we changed the waiting period, the tragedy at the Charleston Church would not have happened. That went through because of the limitation of 3 days on the NICS system. So all of the amendments, I suspect, and I know the first, has limitations, parameters. They talk about how we attend to one another, how we care for one another.
And Mr. Ector,
Yes,
to
sir.
get a little bit further into this, but aren't there some weapons that just inherently would have no practical purpose for the average person? For instance, you can buy a .50 caliber rifle designed by the military to breach armored vehicles and take out the operator. For the average citizen, either in hunting or personal defense, isn't there no practical purpose? However, the risk of great harm, if that were turned on something, let's say a helicopter, isn't that a restriction that is reasonable?
Restrictions, and this word reasonable, I'm sure you're going to keep hearing it from the other side until you're blue in the face. I already talked about the Mariana's $1,000 per handgun tax, per firearm tax. Yes, there are limits. Excuse me, I interrupt you. There are limits. And you know what? Yeah, you can't yell fire in a crowded auditorium, but you know what? We are so far past reasonable restrictions. There's over 20,000 gun laws in the books. The average nuclear reactor plant has more regulations that pale in comparison to that of handguns. We have laws on top of laws from the local level, county level, state level, and federal level. We are drowning in laws. As a matter of fact, it's really hard for us to sometimes obey the law because there's so many things that we have to be cognizant of. Should there be some practical limit as to what an average citizen should have? Well, gee, I don't have a tank. I don't have a lightsaber. There are reasonable limits, and I see nothing wrong with a .50 caliber rifle in the hands of a law-abiding citizen, especially one that is familiar with that firearm, and use it for whatever lawful purpose they deem they wish to participate in. With regards to the Charleston shooter, Diamond Roof, who went into the church and killed 9 people. You know, interesting thing, I went to the Gun Rights Policy Convention just about a week ago, and I talked to personally Dr. John Lott, whose new book is out. It's called The War on Guns, and he actually talked about the Dylan Roof case. And here's the thing. He was arrested for a misdemeanor minor marijuana charge, possession. Allegation that he was using illegally some marijuana. I don't think that any reasonable person would say that you should have your gun rights revoked for a misdemeanor marijuana possession. Just for truth in advertising, I don't partake, but you know what? As a libertarian, if you can do so responsibly in your own home without hurting anyone, go for it. In terms of, should that take away someone's gun rights? No, it shouldn't. And we can't make light of the fact of the atrocious thing that he did, but none of the so-called reasonable gun laws that they're proposing would have made a difference, and it didn't.
But to get a little more specific to this question, are you comfortable having any restrictions on type of firearms other than something like a tank or an explosive device that would be barred under different legislation?
I have no qualms with a person who, under current law, has met the standard. We can determine what those laws are. For example, it is lawful for a person to actually own a fully automatic firearm, subject to following the law. There's additional paperwork and clearances that have to be made. In some cases, if there's not an NFA trust, there has to be a chief law enforcement sign off from your local municipality. And of course, you got to pay the tax man and pay the appropriate taxes. If you can meet the requirements of the law, you're not a prohibited person. You have not been convicted of a felony. You do not have a mental condition such that you are a threat or to other people or to yourself. I see no reason why a law-abiding citizen should be barred from its constitutionally recognized right.
Thank you. And Dr. Brundage, to flip this question, isn't it true that depending on where you go in the country, if you would like a firearm for self-defense, what you need may differ wildly. If you're in a crowded urban area or an apartment building, you might not need a rifle, but if you live out in a very rural area, that may make more sense.
I'm going to focus on your use of the word need, Scott. Need. I don't think we need to have guns everywhere by anyone all of the time. And I'm really surprised that John Lott was referred to here, and all of the gun rights folks sooner or later trot him out. And you need to know that all of his research has been absolutely debunked by several different universities, Stanford, Harvard, to name just a couple. So John Lott really has no credibility at all, and that's it. He has no credibility. He's been debunked many times.
Thank you. So on to our second question, which we'll start with.
Do I get a rebuttal to that, or now we're on to a new question?
No, we're going
I'll
to
just
the
add it
next.
to the next question.
To go on to the next question, which may start, Dr. Brundage. In our state, as with many others, who you are matters a lot in terms of statutes. You get active duty military, police officer, private citizen, convicted felon. So who, from your organization's standpoint, should be permitted to not only possess a firearm, but carry it in public, either open or concealed?
Well, police officers for sure. Trained law enforcement for sure. Not only do they have long training to begin to be a police officer, but they retrain over and over again. So our organization and gun violence prevention organizations nationally support police officers carrying guns and using them appropriately. It's important to note, though, even police officers make mistakes. There's a lot of collateral damage, that sort of thing, with their extensive training. So someone who comes to own a gun and carry a gun with 8 hours or 12 hours of training, it's pretty hard for me to imagine how that person is going to be particularly effective. And I'm sure Mr. Ector knows this better than I. I think it's 10 or 12 years before there has to be any retraining. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind.
So are there any standards in which you think a private citizen should be permitted to have a firearm on their person in public, outside their home?
I don't think it's necessary. I can go to Myers and buy a loaf of bread. I can go and take my middle schooler to their parent-teacher night, and I don't need to carry a gun. I think that's part of what we have to recognize, that all of this rhetoric about, oh my gosh, they got a gun, be afraid, be very afraid. Oh, buy a gun. Oh, more people have guns. Buy a gun, be afraid, be very afraid. That is a very planned, purposeful marketing piece by the NRA, who is an extension of the gun industry. Be afraid. buy a gun. Be afraid, buy a gun. Take a CPL class, buy a gun.
Thank you. Mr. Ector, same question.
You know, it's really interesting when she says that only police officers should have guns. That's probably the most elitist thing I've ever heard. Why should a police officer have greater constitutionally recognized rights than any other person? There's this talk about all this training that they receive, and yes, it is extensive. However, everything that they do is not relevant and germane to the topic of self-defense. I don't need to know how to arrest someone. I don't need to know how to pat someone down. I don't need to know how to do a stakeout. These things here, when we talk about who's allowed to have a firearm, it really gets to the root of gun laws in general. The only reason we have gun laws on the books is because of the racism you kept mentioning in your opening statement. The first gun laws in this country were put on the books to keep recently freed slaves from conducting reprisals against their masters and their overseers. Way back in the city of Detroit, back in 1925, a very famous case that occurred here, the Ossian Sweet trials. This was a case in which a black doctor wanted to own a firearm and have it in his home for personal protection. He moved into the wrong neighborhood. The Klan didn't appreciate it. A mob of 500 people was outside his house. It was an exchange of gunfire. The police were there. They drugged Dr. Sweet and his family out, and they charged Sweet and his brother with a whole host of charges. At the end of the day, he was exonerated, acquitted in 1925 by an all-white jury. The mayor, his attorney was the author of the Scopes trials. The actual judge in the case, Frank Murphy, his name sits on the building right downtown as we speak. In the aftermath of that verdict, the state of Michigan enacted the most draconian gun laws ever created here in the United States. They created these gun boards with discretionary policies such that if you were black, you could not get a gun. They outlawed short-barreled rifles so that black people could not conceal long guns. They created gun registration. Gun registration is another favorite of the anti-gun crowd. It buys you absolutely nothing. Not only is gun control elitist, it's also racist, and it's also sexist when you tell a woman that she shouldn't be allowed to defend herself. She should pretend that she's crazy, has a venereal disease, and try to vomit on herself.
Thank you. And Dr. Brundage, we have a follow-up for you. You mentioned police training, but an issue is in our state, in many departments, there's only annual or biannual training. In fact, there's a police organization that recommends their officers do more on their own time because of that. So aren't there certain private citizens who are far more proficient than many members of the police department?
But I'm not sure what you mean by the word proficient, Scott. I'm sure that there are people that are not police officers that can handle guns well. I don't dispute that. But what I'm trying to point to is the whole notion of thinking about using a gun. And there's a huge emphasis on that piece in gun training for the police. It's not just the things that Mr. Ector said. So I'm pretty comfortable with saying that I think it's our police force that is trained and most able to handle guns appropriately.
So would you be okay with if a program where if a private citizen received training from a police officer, that would qualify them to get a license to carry a weapon in public?
I don't know. I have to say I don't know about that one. It's a bit of a hair split as far as I'm concerned. The thing that the police would have is some oversight, some review, some requirement for retraining, some analysis of when they pulled their gun and what that was about, that private citizens would not be subject to. So that would raise a question about that particular issue for me.
Fair enough. Mr. Ector, the follow-up we have for you is, as Dr. Brundage has stated or referred to, there have been plenty of shootings in which private citizens who purchased firearms legally have killed indiscriminately, even without having a prior record. So isn't there a compelling need in society to have some sort of boundary or some sort of regulation that could at least attempt to prevent that?
Well, when we're talking about law enforcement officers, and I don't want to come across as I'm anti-cop, I have family and friends who are in law enforcement, and they're always in my thoughts and prayers for their safety, especially in this politically charged environment these days. Most law enforcement agencies only allocate time and ammunition for a police officer to discharge his firearm 20 times per year. Only 20 times per year. As a firearms trainer, I can tell you that that is no way to reasonably be certain that you're not going to miss your target. It is irresponsible for a law enforcement officer to shoot that infrequently. Individuals who have taken it upon themselves to take their firearm ownership seriously are at the range training all the time. And so, yes, what you'll find, if you're honest and if you actually look for the stories, they're there, where law-abiding citizens who have their firearms and they take their rights seriously, they train, they practice, they know the law. And by the way, concealed pistol license holders in the state of Michigan are most law-abiding citizens in this state, and as a matter of fact, they're more law-abiding than actual law enforcement officers. The fact that she's even hedging about someone receiving training from a law enforcement officer, hey, I wouldn't want someone to get trained by law enforcement either. I want someone to train more than that so that they're actually capable of doing it. And yes, people are defending themselves almost every single day. There was a guy just in South Carolina who was able to run to a school, a gun-free zone, before the police could get there. And that's what we talk about all the time. Well, gee, when seconds count, you know, the police will be there in minutes. Well, the minutes is not fast enough. Yes, law-abiding citizens can handle the responsibility, and law enforcement officers are no more important and special under the law than everyone else.
But you raise a good point about concealed weapon holders being law-abiding citizens. There are statistics to support that in our state. Isn't that a reason to have requirements that private citizens have at least some level of training or knowledge that a concealed pistol license holder has, in order to ensure that they're safe if they need to or feel they need to discharge a firearm, or just generally speaking, not be a danger to themselves and the public?
I don't think that it goes automatically to assume that because there isn't a state or government mandated training requirement, that automatically translates into citizens being less safe with their firearms. You buy an automobile. You never owned an automobile before. You know what? You don't even need a driver's license to buy a car. You buy it, you have someone else chauffeur you around. With a firearm, it's going to spur you to get the training to operate that safely. One of the biggest hindrances with regards to people exercising their right is government infringements. Once again, reasonable restrictions. We need to have training. In some states, for example, Indiana, there's no training requirement whatsoever. And we're not seeing an issue with concealed pistol license holders there. State of Texas has 4 times the population of Indiana, but you know what? Texas only has 40% more CPL holders. I think mandated training is not a good idea. It'll open up more access and there'll be more training provided.
Thank you very much. Next question, to start with you, Mr. Ector. Looking at one of the largest issues relating to firearms that concerns the public is mass shootings. There have been a wide range of suggestions for the legislature to tackle that issue. What would you find would be the most effective way to deal with the problem, and what is your rationale or reasoning that leads you to believe it would be the most effective?
Mass shootings, by definition, and it's going to depend on whose definition you're using, whether you're using the FBI's or some anti-gun group, but suffice it to say, a mass shooting is when a specified number of people are shot in one location in relative succession. When you look at the individuals who commit these crimes, they're committing these crimes for reasons the average person doesn't understand. In many of these cases, they go to these places with the desired goal of killing and hurting innocent people for no other reason that this is their claim to fame or their pathway to greatness. Yeah, I know it sounds twisted. One thing that we can definitely do is get rid of these attractive honeypots. Here, I'm standing talking to you all in a gun-free zone. If I was actually lawfully concealed carrying or lawfully open carrying, no one would be in any danger from me. But that's the problem with the anti-gun people. Anybody with a gun is perceived as a potential threat. There's no line of demarcation for bad guys and good guys. The other thing that I would do, which would not only help us from mass shooters, and which will also help us with the specter of terrorism, which is becoming an increasingly important issue with incidents happening with increasingly regularity in our country, is to get rid of the requirement for an individual to even have a license. Let's go constitutional carry, and let's get rid of these pistol-free zones. They're killing zones. They're enabling mass and spree shooters.
Thank you. Dr. Brundage?
But it sounds like Mr. Ector is quoting John Locke again. That's one of his main premises, that gun-free zones are killing zones. In fact, that might be the language that he uses. There's no objective, verified research that supports that position at all. To think that somebody, like at the community college in Oregon, they're like, oh, I think I'm going to go kill somebody. I better read that student handbook. Well, I wonder what the state says. What about the laws for community colleges? Mass shootings are a notion of opportunity. And as I said earlier in my remarks, the ones we hear about are the really horrible, horrific ones. That number that Mr. Ector didn't say is mass shootings are generally regarded to be 4 or more people killed in shot and or killed in the same incident, and those, some 80% of those are familial. A father shoots his wife and his kids, shoots himself. That is a typical mass shooting in this country, not the horrible ones that we see on the news for a couple of days till the cycle runs on by us. But I think that's really an important thing to think about. People think about mass shootings, they think of Orlando, they think of Charleston, the community college in Oregon, the San Bernardino killing. Well, those are horrific. They're not the most common kind of mass shooting.
So, do you have a position on what would be the best way to tackle those mass shootings that you're referring to, the most common?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that, Scott.
How would you, what do you deem is best to tackle those mass shootings that you have stated are the most common? What would be the best course of action?
I think it's really important when we get into these gun violence prevention conversations that we don't fall into the notion of there's going to be a law or a position that is going to address all of the horrific gun violence that we experience in our country. So there's probably not one law. As we know, some of the mass shooting, people who have done mass shootings, and probably lots of them that do it in their homes, are legal gun owners. They're good guys until they're not.
Thank you. And the same follow-up question is for both of you. We'll start with you, Mr. Ector. As Dr. Brundage said earlier, one of the times you hear about, or one of the things you hear about most often with mass shootings is mental health. The idea that the perpetrator had to have some mental defect. But is mental health simply a way of sidestepping the issue? Isn't it that more likely that a shooter is going to be sane and just committing an offense. How do you see mental health playing into mass shootings and the gun epidemic in terms of homicides in our nation?
Well, I guess the question you're really asking is, are these people really mentally ill, or are they just evil? Well, there are mentally ill people in this world, and they are evil. I didn't mean to say mentally ill people were evil. Mentally ill people who are a threat to other people, and you have evil people who just delight in doing bad things. These individuals who engage in these mass shootings, contrary to what you heard from my opponent, you don't need to look at some highly researched study funded by George Soros or Michael Bloomberg. All you have to do is open up your newspaper and just look at those places. Gun-free zone, pistol-free zone. We talked about the church, the nightclub in Orlando, the community college, the university, Newtown Elementary School. All these places are gun-free zones, but never mind what you see and what you hear. It wasn't in a study. With respect to whether they're evil, I think the one case is very telling, and that would be the case of Chauvin, the guy who was the Virginia Tech mass killer. He actually was under the care of a psychiatrist, and it was found that even though there were some issues there, he was very nice, he was very polite. He did not in any way demonstrate that he was a danger to himself or other people. What we found out in the aftermath while he was being diagnosed, he knew he was going to conduct this shooting. He was just playing good for the psychiatrist. The bigger issue that I take from that is we're giving the psychiatrist way too much credit. Of all the people who are schizophrenic or have some serious mental issues, all those people are not dangerous. However, the point that I'm stressing to answer this question is psychiatrists are not very good at determining what person with a mental illness will exact violence, probably in a pistol-free zone, and we need to have people there to meet them and put them down quickly.
Dr. Brundage, as a psychiatrist, psychologist,
Yeah.
my apologies, you probably have a lot of experience with this field. So could you please, could you please describe how you view the interplay between mental health and mass shootings?
Well, I tried to address that earlier. Mentally ill people are only responsible for 4% of all violence. All violence. We can only attribute it that way. Mr. Ector is right. Predicting violence is very, very difficult. And that's why the background check system that we have does not leave that to treatment people only. The way it's talked about in Michigan is that mental illness must be adjudicated. That's taken out of the mental health system, and a judge determines whether or not that person is mentally ill after having a series of observations, taking input, taking testimony, and then if that person is adjudicated, which, by the way, the person who did the atrocity in Virginia Tech had in fact been adjudicated mentally ill. However, he was referred to outpatient treatment. He was not adjudicated mentally ill and sent into inpatient treatment. So he did have an adjudication, and that was a problem of the Virginia state reporting system. You'd be glad to know that Michigan does a very good job of sending our information about mentally ill felons and some classes of domestic violence perpetrators into the National Background Check System, which only covers 60% of gun sales.
There you go with that 40% number. I already addressed that.
Please, let's stick to what
Right.
is our assigned things. But thank you very much, Dr. Brundage. Let's
You know
move.
what? I need to take a break for like a few minutes. Is it possible we could pause? Take a break?
Is that all right, Dr. Brundage?
I didn't hear what the question was.
Mr. Director would like to take a break. Is that all right?
You would like to do what?
You'd like to take a break. How long do you need?
5 minutes.
Okay.
Be right back.
And just so everyone knows, I did not announce this early on, my apologies. Both of the panelists have stated that they will be here for a few minutes afterwards if anyone would like to talk to them. I know Dr. Brundage has placed some materials over there, so if you're interested, feel free to grab them, and we will continue in about 5 minutes.
There's also material over here, Scott, from Million Moms March, Michigan, and the Brady campaign. They're part of our coalition, and they also brought materials to share.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. When everyone's ready, we're going to continue, so please take a seat.
How long are we going to go?
We're going to continue till 9, and we'll get to break the microphone. This one. All right. All right. Are both of you ready?
Ready?
All right. So let's finally move more specific to our state. Dr. Brundage, you have the first run at this question. We're going to start broad. You two are both very active in terms of trying to get Michigan policy changed. What do you see is the biggest weakness of the current Michigan firearm legislation?
Well, we've been around it a little bit. At this point, it is background checks. In Michigan, you only have to have a background check to buy a pistol. We have legislation that's been proposed that would extend the pistoling process to long guns in Michigan. It would extend it to internet sales and private sales. There are exceptions in this proposed legislation for legacy, gifts, father to son, uncle to brother, those kinds of things. And the law specifically says there will not be a gun registration process in Michigan. So that's the way the law is written, and we definitely support that. all the kinds of gun violence that we're talking about, or we're trying to talk about here, have one thing in common, and that is easy access. And I don't see any problem in people waiting 24, 48, a week long to get a gun, if it means saving a life, and, you know, particularly access is pivotal for suicide. So I think, you know, we do need to strengthen the background check system in Michigan and throughout the country.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ector, same question. What is the most glaring fault you see with current Michigan legislation on firearms?
Oh man, there's a ton of stuff that we could do to increase safety and respect the individual rights of people to keep and bear arms. But you know what? Let me take the background check question. You know, it's just been mentioned that if a person is stopped, say 24 to 48 hours from having the ability to buy a firearm, a sort of cooling off period, that's actually saving a life. Isn't the protection of people whose lives are in danger someone who actually needs a gun? Someone who was involved in a domestic violence situation? Someone who, for whatever reason, has become the fixation of some strange, weird person? Someone who has, in the aftermath, decided to get a personal protection order, which is really just a POP, a piece of paper. A piece of paper is not going to protect you from someone who is intent upon hurting you. So yeah, I would stipulate that waiting periods would not lead to safety. Secondly, with regards to background checks, I think she didn't quite state the actual law. In Michigan, or you know what, across the country, all guns which are purchased through a federal firearms licensee are required to go through a background check. So let's make sure that we're clear on that. And of course, handguns are included in that. Currently in the state of Michigan, if you want to buy a handgun, you either need to have a concealed pistol license, which basically serves as your background check, or you need to go to your local law enforcement agency and get the background check. With regards to, you know, this whole thing about the system itself, the background checks, the NICS, it's flawed. They have 2.4 million initial rejections. 97 to 98% of that 2.4 million lives that they're claiming is 2.4 million people who have false positives and are inconvenienced from exercising their constitutional rights.
Mr. Ector, I would like to ask, do you see any problems with the legislation as it currently stands that you would like to change? That you were
there's a ton of legislation. Let's get rid of handgun registration. It does absolutely nothing to you. Let's have a parking lot bill. You should be able to protect yourself on your way to work and on your way home. Let's get constitutional carry. It will lead to more training. More people will actually be trained. What else can we do? We can allow people, if they desire, to conceal carry in public schools. Currently, we're only lawfully allowed to open carry, dropping off our children, if we have a concealed pistol license. The list of these infringements go on and on. They always want to put more restrictions. They never want to compromise. And you know what? It's fine, because you know what? I don't want to compromise either.
Thank you. We're going to move to a question that I'm sure both of you, based on what you've said before, have a position on this. Here in Detroit, we have a police chief who is very active and focused on this issue. So, starting with Mr. Ector, what would your response be to Detroit Police Chief Craig's assertion that an increase in the overall number of private citizens being armed has led to a lower violent crime rate in the city of Detroit?
It's absolutely true, and as a matter of fact, I organized a field trip to the Detroit Board of Police Commissioners last year for us to publicly thank him for actually having the courage to make that proclamation. It's true. More citizens, more guns in the hands of law-abiding citizens make us all safer. A bad guy who's looking for people to victimize, he's looking for people who are frail, who are weak, who are unable to mount a defense. He doesn't want to get injured. He's looking for old people, he's looking for women, and the simple fact that there's more people that are armed, it creates a hazardous working environment for that criminal. And one thing I like to say to Chief Craig, and I like that they brought him in, but he was brought in by the emergency financial manager. Had Mike Duggan, who has a history of being anti-gun, especially when he was a prosecutor, someone who always made disparaging remarks with regards to gun rights. Glad he left. Unfortunately, he's now mayor of Detroit, but you know what? I had a chance to ask him at a local town hall, has his view on concealed carry changed, even though we've proved that we're law-abiding and we have a definite decrease in crime. You know what? He said, he took the coward's way out. He said, well, you know, I still would have liked for the voters to have decided. So even in the face of facts that proved everything that we said, and that there wasn't going to be blood running in the streets, and L. Brooks Patterson putting up a sign, welcome to Dodge City, all those dire projections turned out to be absolutely false. And yeah, you know what? Not only am I protecting myself, I'm actually protecting the anti-gunners so they can walk around with their head in the sky and pretend like bad things don't happen to good people.
Thank you. Dr. Brundage, how would you respond to Police Chief Craig's assertion?
Well, I see the facts differently. Violent crime has gone down all across the country, and to say that that's because there are more guns in the streets of Detroit is an erroneous interpretation of the facts. And I also would like people to know that Chief Craig is an aberration among chiefs of police nationwide. Most chiefs of police want better gun control, particularly something that I hope is going to come to Michigan. They're particularly with us in banning assault weapons, because that's when police are killed the most often. So the chief of police of Philadelphia, New York City, many of the chiefs in equal-sized cities throughout the country see it very differently than Chief Craig does. And I agree with them.
Thank you. I have some follow-ups for you. Mr. Ector, isn't it true, though, that there are other major factors that come into play when looking at violent crime statistics, such as economic opportunities, drug use, and issues such as that? Isn't the contention that firearms have led to a lowering of the violent crime rate simply overblown?
Well, first and foremost, Chief Craig is not the aberration, and you don't have to go too far to look at Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clark to know that, you know, Chief Craig is the aberration. Two, when you look at how Clark is in his position, he actually won an election. People voted for him because they like him and his views. With regards to Chief Craig, he was appointed by an emergency financial manager, and we're glad that we got him for his pro-gun adult views with regards to firearm legislation. Most big city mayors are Democrats who are historically anti-gun, and the police chief serves at the behest of that mayor. And as a matter of fact, 2013, a Police One poll showed that the majority of law enforcement officers support arming the public. With regards to other factors, sure, there's other factors that determine violent crime rates. Absolutely, but you know what? Let's let the policymakers, let's let the politicians fix what's wrong with our society, whether it's a lack of opportunity, broken nuclear families, whether it's drug use, you name it, Crimea River. My problem is when a violent thug shoves a gun in my face and presents a threat to my safety and will probably kill me even if I comply with his commands. Well, you know what? We need to have firearms to protect ourselves until the policymakers solve all the ills and woes that befell our fallen cities all across the country.
Thank you. Dr. Brundage, part of Police Chief Craig's assertion comes from the position that criminals are more conscious of private citizens being armed, and the risk-averse ones are not going to be going to or attempting to commit those offenses. And there's a little bit of polling data to support that. Do you think that, yes, how would you respond to the position that, in fact, yes, criminals are adverse to risks of private citizens shooting them while they commit their offenses, and that contributes to the lowering of the violent crime rate?
I don't agree. I don't know what research you might be citing there, but I think it's quite to the contrary. Criminals are going to do what they're going to do. I mean, it's similar to the example that I was trying to share about Oregon Community College. I mean, criminals don't walk up and down the street saying, oh, I think they've got a gun. Oh, I wonder if they got a gun. Well, I better put mine away. No, that's not the way it goes. I don't think there's research to support that position, Scott.
Thank you. So this is actually a great time for one of the questions we have specifically for you, Dr. Brundage.
Okay, bring it.
So Michigan has had a number of highly publicized self-defense shootings. We had the GM valet who shot the woman stabbing her mother.
He didn't shoot her, he just covered that boy.
Thank you, Mr. Ector. We also had the woman who was in her home in Detroit when 5 men attempted to break in, and she fired at them and they immediately fled. So isn't there at least some data to support the fact that citizens being armed does help to protect them from violent criminals and does have a positive impact on society that way?
There is very little evidence that defensive use of guns works. It doesn't. I wanted to go back to the question of domestic violence that was raised a little bit ago, and I don't know if one would categorize that as defensive gun use or not, but this is Domestic Violence Month, this month of October, and we know that guns in the home mean a woman in a domestic violence situation is 50% more likely to lose her life if there's a gun in the home. I mean, so, I think I veered a little bit from that defensive use of guns, but there's very little reported episodes of defensive gun use. It's not 33,000, I'll tell you that.
Thank you. Do you have a rebuttal, Mr.
The answer is actually a lot bigger than 33,000. Another criminologist you may be familiar with, Dr. Kleck out of Florida, he estimates 2 million DGUs per year, defensive gun uses of a firearm. And every defensive use of a firearm does not actually mean that someone got shot. The mere presentation of that firearm, reaching for that firearm, there's over 2 million uses. It's rather shocking to me that there seems to be some refusal to accept that law-abiding citizens lawfully owning guns, actually using them to actually defend themselves or other people. I guess those folks shouldn't have guns and they should just lay down and just die. With regards to, I don't get it. And you know what? I don't have to get it. They have just a different mindset with regards to this whole concept of self-defense. The government is not responsible for your safety. Let that sink in. Well, gee, who's responsible for your safety? She said, well, bad guys are going to do what bad guys do. If they're going to rob, rape, carjack, drag you off, and otherwise assault you, then hey, that's what they're going to do. You know what? Don't do anything. Just lay back and enjoy it. My thing is, if you have an opportunity to defend yourself and your family, you should avail yourself of that. And with respect to criminals identifying victims, there is a victim selection process. They're looking for people who are small, who are short, who are frail, who are female, and who are elderly. They have a dangerous occupation. If the person they're sizing up for victimization is strong, can defend themselves, can hurt them, they will not select them for an attack. And as a matter of fact, there was even a study out there, I didn't write it down, it just came to me, where they actually interviewed inmates. and they said that they truly are fearful of law-abiding citizens who are armed, and they go out of their way to avoid those folks.
Thank you. And Dr. Brundage, Mr. Ector actually hit on one of the points that we had prepared to ask you as a follow-up to this. There are many people who are victims who cannot physically overpower their attacker. Doesn't access to a firearm give them a better opportunity to defend themselves against people they could not otherwise fight?
Well, I don't think it does. You have to be willing to kill another human being. And there's a fair amount of research that when we look into the eyes of another human being, we're actually looking back at ourselves. So if you're shooting out, you have to be willing to kill another human being. And I don't think most of us are. I'm going to veer a little from the question, Scott. We've had a lot of disagreement here about what the research says. And I think that is a big problem. There is a lot of difference about what constitutes gun violence prevention research. And part of the reason that we have this discrepancy is the NRA lobbied in Washington to prevent the Center for Disease Control from doing gun research. Well, so now why is this important? We've had disagreements about the scale of the problem. How many people are shot? Is the number rising or falling, i.e. in Detroit? Who gets shot? Just little old ladies? And under what circumstances? With what weapons? Second, what are the causes? What leads people to shoot other people or kill themselves? We need this kind of data. Third is learning what works to prevent gun violence. Fourth is figuring out how to translate these findings that we would get from good research into policy. Legislators across the country have enacted laws allowing the open carry of firearms on the street or in public places, or authorizing teachers to carry guns in the classroom on campus with no idea whether that would result in more people being killed or more lives being saved. If research on cancer was stopped for one single day, there'd be a huge protest. But this research has been stopped by the CDC for over 20 years. Don't we want our best and brightest to inform policy in this country?
Thank you. And Mr. Ector, realistically though, it's not just smaller people defending themselves against a bigger attacker, is it? A lot of times, don't you have people perfectly capable of causing physical violence or harm to another individual, but for instance, gang members will still employ a gun in order to harm their, or cause greater harm or greater fear in their victims? Is it having more citizens armed not necessarily create a safer society?
First and foremost, let me address this whole warm, fuzzy feeling that was attempted just a few minutes ago. The fact that someone is trying to rape you, and you're looking and gazing into those big blue eyes, and you're saying, ooh, I see myself. I'm not willing to defend myself against your rape. I think it's hilarious and it's outrageous. The fact that you believe that most people or all people are not capable or willing to defend themselves, and you're in psychiatry, it smacks of projection. If you are a person who does not see yourself as capable of defending yourself, you know what? Maybe you believe that other people can't, despite all the stories of defensive gun uses that occur in the media on a regular, ongoing basis. With regards to gangs, yes, gangs are a problem. And you know what? We need to address them. What the root causes are, who knows? When we get them, when we catch them, when we prosecute them, When we send them off, rehabilitate them. If you can't, leave them there.
Thank you very much. So let's move back into our general questions. And I believe this one is now up to Dr. Brundage again. Looking to the past, Michigan used to have very restrictive firearm laws, but after becoming a shall issue state, statistics show that the violent crime rate in Michigan over the last 10 years has actually dropped. Is there a correlation between the two?
No, I think we tried to address that with the notion, Chief Craig, for instance, has put that argument forth, and I don't think that that is supported. Violent crime is down all over the nation, and I don't think it has anything to do with us being a shall issue state.
Thank you. Mr. Ector?
I vehemently and strongly disagree. You know, the data is there. It directly correlates to the number of guns in actual circulation. The crime rate is down. I mean, it's right there in front of your face. And you know what? If you don't want to accept what you see, shame on your eyes for lying to you. You know, guns allow people to protect themselves. Criminals do not want to get shot. It's really that simple. And lo and behold, despite all of the clergy, despite law enforcement, despite local Democrat, anti-gun politicians, we got this law done. There was no blood running in the streets. There was not the shootout at the OK Corral. If you are discharged with the responsibility of defending yourself, you should be allowed to do that. And she won't even make allowances for being in your home, shooting off 5 home invaders, which to me is just outrageous. But you know what? If you can't or won't defend yourself, who can and will? There was just a story, what was it, like a week ago or a few days ago. There was a woman on the telephone calling 911. And she's like, hey, I need help. Somebody send help. And they're like, they're coming. And then you hear the woman being killed live over the 911 call. Would have been nice if she had a gun, instead of just looking into his dreamy blue eyes.
Whoa.
Thank you, Mr. Ector.
I don't think I said that.
So moving though to proposed gun laws, let's look towards the future. The state legislature is currently considering removing schools and college buildings from conceal-free zones, from open carry zones, and making it permissible for a person with a CPL to carry there. So do you think, or what do you think the results of that would be? And do you have any evidence to support it? Mr. Ector?
Well, there was an effort back in 2012 to address open carry in schools. And a lot of debate, a lot of conversations were being had. And that was part of those conversations. And you know, we thought we'd strike a compromise. You know, heaven forbid we're compromising, because we wanted to get something which was to be able to carry in schools. With all the mass shooting incidents, you know what? At least let us push the ball forward and fight another day. Unfortunately, you know, the Sandy Hook happened, and the governor, despite assurances from third-party sources, he folded like a cheap suit and failed to sign the legislation. If we want to make sure that our schools are safe, you know what, allowing parents to carry guns in the schools, you know, that's fine and dandy, but there needs to be somebody there. Somebody who's like a teacher, an administrator, a janitor, someone who's done everything that's required of him to carry a gun, so that when a bad guy shows up, someone can do something. Here we're in a college university, and I routinely stay out of gun-free zone because I realize that I'm responsible for my safety. Some knucklehead comes in here and starts shooting up the place. I have no protection whatsoever, you know. I think one thing that will help, because we do have some projectionists out there, people who like to project their ability to handle a firearm onto people who have proven it. Currently in the state of Michigan, you can only open carry in a school if you have a concealed pistol license. At least change the law so that individuals who wish to continue doing so can at least take the gun out of view if they desire to risk offending someone's sensibilities. And by the way, I looked at the Constitution last night. You do not have a constitutional right to be offended, especially being offended if someone actually exercising their right.
Thank you. Dr. Brundage, should parents be permitted to have, actually first, I apologize, I don't believe you had the opportunity to answer directly about what do you feel the results would be and if you had any evidence to support.
I think if we have concealed carry in our public schools, our universities, our bars, our stadiums, there will be havoc in Michigan. Recently I talked to somebody who's a big gun owner, grew up in the UP, owns I don't know how many guns, and he happens to be a teacher. And he engaged his fellow teachers in a conversation about what could go wrong with concealed carry in the schools. Can you imagine an adolescent with an attitude, knowing someone has a gun, a teacher has a gun, picking it off, or knowing where the teacher keeps the gun, pulling it out of the drawer, somebody drops the gun, it goes off. That's happened in other schools, throughout the country. So more guns does not make us safer, and I think that's particularly true in our public schools. We don't need them in our public schools. You can look at lots of situations where police were very close at hand. Columbine is one good example of that. Nothing was done to stop the perpetration of that atrocity. So more guns, guns everywhere. Again, that's an NRA-driven notion. The senator that introduced Senate Bill 442, if you want to look it up, got a big award from the NRA in one of those slick jackets. And then he introduced the bill again after Governor Snyder vetoed it in 2012. I think there's a relationship there between the attention he gets from the NRA. He also, I might mention to you, when this bill was brought up in October of 15 through the, up to the Senate Judiciary Committee, they brought in John Locke, who's totally discredited. So, you know, I'm against guns in schools, period.
Thank you. Now we can get to the follow-up questions. My apologies again. Mr. Ector, Dr. Brundage actually raised the issue which he was talking about. There are plenty of things in schools that are supposed to be secure that are not. Equipment that is literally screwed into walls is stolen. Exams, which are locked away and hidden, are stolen. Isn't there a risk where if you have multiple teachers armed, that you will have students inevitably getting their hands on firearms if they desire to?
No, I don't believe it's possible that they would have an opportunity to get their hands on those firearms if they desire to. I couldn't contain myself here listening to students surreptitiously sneaking over and taking a gun out of an unlocked desk or taking it out of some unsecured purse or some unsecured storage area. Make no mistake about it, owning a gun is a huge responsibility. And you're responsible for making sure that unauthorized users do not gain access to that firearm. Okay? Whether there's an actual locked container, fine, or if the administration or personnel choose, and I strongly suggest that they do so, they carry those firearms on their actual person. As a matter of fact, they actually do stuff like that over in Israel because they live second by second over there from terrorists wanting to do them harm. With regards to guns everywhere, you know what? We actually have working models where we can actually see some of this stuff working. with the elimination of gun-free zones such as bars in Ohio and in Texas, other states. We actually have data and we actually see what's happening. Guess what's happening? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The fact that you have a gun in a bar, you know what? There's no reason why you cannot have a gun in a bar. The only problem comes in, and I believe that guns and alcohol doesn't mix. You know what? If you want to go out and meet friends and watch the football game at BW's, fine. Just don't drink any alcohol. The fuzzy story about this guy who was brainstorming the way things could happen, you know what? You have a responsibility to keep that firearm away from unauthorized users. And if the school districts want to come up with a procedure and a protocol, you know what, to keep those guns away from kids, fine, they can do that. It's easy. No one will be in jeopardy. And if some deranged individual comes into the school, there will be a first responder there to address it.
Thank you. Dr. Brundage, shouldn't parents who have legitimate business on school grounds, who would like a firearm on the person to protect them or their children, be allowed to carry their gun onto public school grounds?
No.
That was a very quick answer. Would you like to elaborate? Or
No, that's it. What do you need a gun for if you're going to pick up your middle schooler, or you're going to parent-teacher conferences, or you're at a Little League game, or you're at a soccer game? Really? That's part of the be afraid. Be very afraid. Be afraid, buy a gun. Be afraid, buy a gun. Take a CPL course, buy a gun. Buy a gun. Be afraid. That is an absolute marketing ploy of the NRA, who is a shill for the gun industry. Smith & Wesson's stock went up 92% in the third quarter. We all know the mass shootings that happened in the third quarter. So that's part of the marketing that's going on.
thank you. We're starting to run low on time, so I'd like to ask you about the last questions we had directed at one party, because they are a bit tougher than the general ones. So let's start with Dr. Brundage. We have many people in our nation who are determined to kill other human beings any way they can. We've had the largest, in Michigan, we had the largest school massacre in Bath, Michigan, which used explosives. We have a person who drove into a farmer's market, killing over a dozen people. We've had mass knife attacks. Isn't it true, though, that if a person is determined to kill, they will do it regardless of access to a firearm?
I don't think there's research that supports that. And we know that guns kill. That's the purpose of a gun, is to kill. That's the reason they're made. That's the reason they're marketed. Well, they're marketed to make money for the gun industry. But the purpose of a gun is to kill. There are other reasons to have a knife or a hammer, or sometimes they say a spoon. But guns are produced to kill. And that's in fact what they do.
Thank you. Do you have a rebuttal, Mr. Ector?
Yeah. Earlier, my opponent talked about reasonable or reasonableness. All I've heard from her today has been, who needs a gun? We don't need a gun here. We don't need a gun there. We don't need a gun there. No, I don't think guns can save lives. No, people should have guns. I don't see the reasonableness that she advertised. To me, it sounds like a flat-out gun banner wanting to repeal the Second Amendment without getting 2/3 of the states to actually ratify the eradication of gun ownership in this country. Nevertheless, gun ownership is important. You are your own first responder. A committed foe, adversary, criminal, rapist will use whatever tool is at their disposal. If they can't get a gun, you know what? they'll start robbing people with knives. And yes, you know what? Some people, believe it or not, find it hard to actually get their hands on a gun. We have our president who ridiculously states that people can buy a gun faster than they can buy a book, which was, you know, you have to take that with several grains of salt. Over in Canada, they don't have so many firearms, but you know what? Their violence is still as high as it's ever been. And if the violent folks over there can get access to a gun, they are stabbing and using guns and, knives and other sharp objects to keep the rate of violence and deaths and homicides as high as it's ever been. Over in China, there was a mass stabbing. You know what? He didn't have a gun, but you know what? He had a knife. And he stabbed approximately 28 children to death before he was actually stopped. So yeah, if you're committed, you'll find a way. Despite whether there's a personal protection order, despite a pistol-free zone, despite a sign on the outside of the door saying no guns allowed, that's that magical thinking that the other side likes to believe. They just cannot fathom the fact that evil truly exists, that bad guys do what bad guys do. There's no way of reasoning with them. And you know what? I don't care how long you stare into their eyes. You are not going to make a connection. You know what? Defend yourself. It's your job, it's your duty, and your responsibility. So let's make sure that we keep guns lawful and away from this so-called reasonableness I've heard about today.
Thank you. And Dr. Brundage, do you have a follow-up? Going off the same question of a person who wants to commit great bodily harm, who doesn't have access to a gun, isn't a firearm still provide a defense against those people? In Detroit and in New Orleans as well, there was a police response rate time of somewhere between 37 and 45 minutes. If police cannot address a person's call at their home within that time, isn't a potential victim likely to have the criminal offense be carried out against them?
I'm going to go off here, Scott, because we spent nearly the entire debating time talking about homicides, and we have 33,000 people who die in the United States every year. We have a public health crisis in our country. 22